Welcome back to the Universalis podcast. I am Martin Kochański, the creator of Universalis, and in this episode I'll be looking at the highlights of the week ahead, starting with Sunday, the 18th of May. Now that we have a papal name which has not been used for 120 years, I think it is a good idea to go back over history and see what popes with that name have done. There are 13 of them, after all. Let's start quickly with the name itself. Leo means lion. There is nothing superstitious or astrological about the name. It was a normal and reasonable first name for people to have, at least as far back as around 300 BC. In the Eastern Roman Empire, 6 emperors used the name Leo. We are rather used to popes taking a new name when they become pope, just as, for example, Benedictine monks take a new name when they become monks. So your friends will inevitably be asking you, why did the first Pope Leo call himself Leo? I'm afraid you are going to have to disappoint them. The first Pope Leo called himself Leo because Leo was his name. This business of popes taking a name that wasn't their own is rather recent. The first case in history was Pope John II, who became Pope in 533. His name was Mercurius, and it didn't sound quite right to have a pope named after the Roman god Mercury. Gradually, popes started to take new names because they sounded less foreign than their real ones, or because they wanted to set a theme, like Pope Francis, or honour their predecessors. Thus Albino Luciani, Pope John Paul, took the names of his 2 predecessors to emphasize continuity. And after the briefest papacy in modern times, Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, used the same name again in order to show that that choice was not a mistake. This gives us another reason to look into the earlier Leos beyond mere amusement and curiosity. It's not that by calling himself Leo XIV, the man previously known as Robert has given us some coded message whose true meaning is known only to a few, but clearly he has found something to attract him in the Leonine themes. There have been many Leos over the millennia, and between them they make stepping stones through a very, very rapid history of the Church. It would be dreadful to pack a single podcast episode with all 13 Leos, so we will have the first 4 of them this time and the rest later. The first Pope Leo was Pope from 440 to 461 AD. He was not, of course, Pope Leo I at the time. My sister's history teacher once tried to make her pupils think by telling them that there never was such a monarch as Queen Elizabeth I, or at least not until 1952, when a second Elizabeth became queen. The class was divided, my sister reports, among the girls who got it, the girls who understood it when it was explained to them by their friends at break, and the girls who didn't get it and never would. But the newness of the first Pope Leo is not a joke. We tend to think of posts and titles as being something along the lines of, here is a job, and here is the person who is currently doing that job. The interesting thing in Leo's time is that nobody quite knew what the job was, not yet. They weren't yet entirely sure what the Church was. After all, when Leo was born, the Church had been officially tolerated and protected for less than 100 years, and Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire within his own father's lifetime. Everything was very new. There had never been a church before. Paganism was an aggregation of local temples and local cults. Yes, it was possible for a state to have its own official gods, but even those were worshipped locally by temples and priests who didn't have much to do with one another. A single, transnational religious institution had never happened before. Nobody really knew what sort of thing this ought to be, and we have so far spent more than a millennium and a half trying to work it out. The most important side of all this has to be theology, even if worldly questions of territory and politics and authority sometimes obscure that fact. Christ came to earth once. He taught once. He gave one single accreditation to the apostles. If it had not been like that, then Christ would indeed have been one God among other gods. There would have been no clashes with the imperial authorities, no martyrs, no worries about heresy or schism. Wherever in the world you went, you could have found some sort of Christ-flavoured way of life, and you wouldn't inquire too much into the details. But God is one, and Christ is one. It is all Jesus' fault. He said he would come to bring a sword to divide us, and he did. Leo's biggest and longest-lasting achievement was twofold. First of all, he worked to establish orthodoxy and combat heresy. Secondly, he built up a structure of authority by which orthodoxy could be established and heresy could be combated, placing it on a secure foundation centred on the Bishop of Rome. Unthinking people nowadays can be a bit wet about heresy. They say it's nothing but independent thought, that kind of thing. But wrong doctrine has real consequences in any important subject, in science, in medicine, and in theology. For instance, take Arianism, which sees Jesus Christ as not the Son of God, but just a privileged creature. It effectively denies the redemption, makes the whole episode of the Incarnation into some kind of a theatrical performance, and it very definitely does not open a way for us to heaven and eternal life. So it needs to be fought, and there has to be a way to fight it. At the very least, it has to be labelled clearly as what it is, Christian-flavoured if you like, but not Christianity. We have some of Leo's sermons still. They are clear, simple and authoritative. We still read quite a few of them in the Office of Readings, and unlike some very early sermons, they really are a pleasure to read or hear. The next one comes on Wednesday the 28th, the Wednesday before the Ascension. It is about precisely the time we are living through now, the time between Easter and the Ascension. Look out for it, and if you are subscribing to the spoken readings in Universalis, as I hope you are, listen to it. If you aren't subscribing, do. Turning away from theology, Rome in the middle of the 5th century, when Leo became Pope, was very, very rich, having acquired the wealth of the world for something like 500 years. It was also very, very weak, practically indefensible in fact. This was the reason why, in the 4th century, the emperors had divided the Roman Empire into two. A Western Empire centred on Rome, and an Eastern Empire centred on the old Greek colony of Byzantium, which was called Constantinople after the Emperor Constantine, and which the Turks now call Istanbul. Rome was an obvious target for wandering bands of barbarians. Some of them wanted to become a recognised part of Roman power structures, others just wanted to steal and pillage whatever they could. Alaric the Visigoth sacked Rome in 410 AD, the first time the city had been conquered in 800 years. This sent shockwaves throughout the Roman world, but the Visigoths had been Christians of a kind, they were Arians, and Alaric died the same year, so Rome stumbled on. In 452, when Leo had been pope for 12 years, it was Attila the Hun who was approaching Rome, and his aim was simple destruction. The Huns came from somewhere in Central Asia. They were distant aliens, and they even looked it. Contemporaries described them as short, broad-shouldered, black-haired with little or no beard, humorless and indescribably savage. In northeastern Italy, the inhabitants of the city of Aquileia abandoned their homes as the Huns approached, and fled into impenetrable marshes when no one could find them. These damp, frightened refugees were the founders of the city of Venice, whose power would last for more than 1,000 years. Attila the Hun was coming, and the Roman emperor sent Leo to him as an emissary. Leo persuaded Attila not to attack Rome but to withdraw instead. Rome was saved. 3 years later, in 455, it was the turn of the Vandals under Genseric. Like the Visigoths, they were Arians. Leo went out to meet them too, and Rome was semi-saved. The Vandals agreed to steal and plunder only, and not to kill or destroy. Leo died in 461. The barbarian invasions continued. Some raided, others stayed. The end of the Roman Empire came in a discreet and civilized way. In 475, a 13-year-old boy was made emperor. He took the double name Romulus Augustulus, after Romulus, the founder of Rome, and Augustus, the first of the emperors. The next year he was pensioned off into an honourable retirement, and Rome, from being part of the Western Roman Empire, became part of the Gothic Kingdom of Italy. The popes continued. Since the empire in the West had failed, Constantinople claimed authority over Italy, even though it was not often strong enough to enforce it. The Eastern emperors soon claimed the right to approve the choice of pope as well. Pope St. Leo II belongs to this period. He was pope from 681 to 683. He was a Sicilian and thus the heir of both Greek and Latin culture. There is not much record of what he did during his 2-year reign. Now we can jump 100 years to the late 8th century. The barbarians who had taken over in the north of Europe, the Franks and the Lombards, had been settled there for long enough to count as natives. Lombardy in northern Italy is still named after the Lombards. As for the Franks, when they invaded Gaul, it was eventually named after them, Francia, Francia, or now France. This was the time of Pope St. Leo III. Charles, King of the Franks and King of the Lombards, united much of Western Europe under his rule. Leo III was elected Pope in 795 with Charles's support. He accepted Charles as the protector of Rome and the papacy, and invited him to visit Rome in 800, where, in St. Peter's Basilica on Christmas Day, he crowned him emperor and anointed his son Charles as king. That was the beginning of a long, complicated balance of power relationship between empire and papacy. Popes gave legitimacy to the emperors, while the emperors had, or tried to have, a big say in who the next pope would be. Now, for the first time in centuries, there was a proper empire in the West. We call its emperor Charles the Great, or Charlemagne. His empire would fall into separate kingdoms after his death, but the cultural renaissance Charlemagne set off did not fade. It preserved the learning of the ancient world until the West was ready to be nourished by it in the intellectual explosion of the 12th and 13th centuries. Pope Leo III and Charlemagne continued as allies until Charlemagne died in 814. Leo himself died 2 years later. Of course, Rome would not have been Rome without invaders. In Leo III's time there were Saracens, that is to say, Arabs. Leo had to maintain a fleet to patrol the coastline against their raids. In 846, 30 years after Leo's death, the Saracens attacked Rome and caused huge destruction. Leo IV became pope the following year. He was elected and consecrated in a great hurry without consultation with the emperor in case the Saracens suddenly attacked again. Leo spent most of his reign repairing the damage and putting the walls of Rome into good defensive order. He rebuilt 15 of its towers. He was the first to build walls round the Vatican Hill, which is on the other side of the river Tiber from the rest of Rome. When a Saracen fleet attacked in 849, Leo summoned the fleets of Naples and other nearby states to his aid, and the Saracens were destroyed. Long before the Crusades started, it was an example of how Christians, as long as they were united, were still able to defend themselves. Leo IV died in 855, but if you are English, there's a charming footnote to his reign. In 853, in the middle of all his work of defence and rebuilding, Pope Leo IV found time to receive the 5-year-old son of Ethelwulf, King of Wessex, and invest him with the sword and tunic of a Roman consul. The boy's name was Alfred, and he would grow up to become King Alfred the Great. So those are the first 4 Leos. They are all of them revered as saints, and in the old St. Peter's Basilica they lay buried together in the same tomb. The next 4 Leos were not saints at all. You can hear their story in next week's episode. After a quiet time with saints in the liturgical calendar, there's a flowering of them in this coming week. There are local saints as well as saints who are celebrated worldwide. Your calendar will only show you the saints where you happen to live, so have a look at the About Today page in Universalis to read about all the others. In particular, do look at Monday's page to read about a Malagasy saint. Madagascar was quite a discovery for me in Universalis. It happened like this. One day I received an email from an archbishop in Madagascar asking me if I could add the Liturgy of the Hours in his language to Universalis. Being foolishly impetuous, I said yes. I say foolishly because although adding a new language simply means a lot of cutting and pasting, a lot of cutting and pasting really is a lot. Day after day for 3 weeks I kicked myself for letting myself in for this, but in the end the thing was done, so now anybody in Madagascar who has a phone can read the Hours every day without charge. The only words of the Malagasy language I can remember now are Fiderana Maraina, which means morning prayer. But the saints of Madagascar are an interesting lot. The country itself is quite unusual. It is next to Africa, but not really of Africa. It was colonized in around 800 AD by Polynesian explorers from Borneo, and the Malagasy language is a Polynesian one. On Monday the 19th we celebrate Blessed Raphael Louis Rafiringa, who was born in 1856. His father was an important functionary at the Queen's court and in charge of the royal slaves. He received his early education from the Queen's sorcerers, until when he was 10 he met some missionaries from the Christian Brothers and saw that they held the real truth. He was baptized at the age of 14, taught at the De La Salle Brothers' School, and then joined the order, the first native of Madagascar to do so. The pagan kings and queens of Madagascar were strong rulers, and kept their independence until the French decided to try to conquer their island in 1883. Then all Christian missionaries were expelled, leaving nobody but the lay converts to carry on Christianity. Brother Raphael was one of these. Another was Blessed Victoria Rasoamanarivo, daughter-in-law of the Prime Minister. They publicly defended the Catholic Church against the authorities and kept the people's faith alive. When the French War of Conquest ended and the missionaries were allowed to return in 1886, they found a vigorously flourishing Christian community. Brother Raphael was greatly honoured for his work in facilitating peace between Madagascar and France, but in 1915 he was arrested by the French authorities on suspicion of belonging to a secret nationalist sect. At his trial he was acquitted, but he had been weakened by fever after his time in prison, and he died on the 19th of May 1919. It is an education doing Universalis. I discover things I would not have discovered in any other way. I hope you have the same feeling reading it. Other saints this week include, on Wednesday, St. Christopher Magallanes and his companions, martyred by the Mexican government in 1927. He gave all his possessions to his executioners and gave them absolution. On Thursday there's St. Rita of Cascia, who lived a life most of us would think impossible, but triumphed in it over and over again. The story is too long to tell here, so have a look at the About Today page for that day. She is honoured as a patron saint of impossible or lost causes. I can't not mention the letter to Diognetus, which is the second reading in the Office of Readings on Wednesday. The letter to Diognetus was written in the late 2nd century to a correspondent who had asked the question what Christians were. It dropped out of history entirely shortly after it was written. A 13th century manuscript of it was found in a fishmonger's shop in Constantinople in 1436, where it was being used as wrapping paper. In 1870 the manuscript was in Strasbourg, where it was destroyed by a fire started by Prussian artillery in the Franco-Prussian War, but copies had been made and published. The question, what is a Christian, is just as important now as it was in the 2nd century. It is well worth reading Wednesday's second reading to see how much, if at all, we have changed since then. That's all for this week. If you'd like to write to us about anything, send an email to universalis@universalis.com. We look forward to hearing from you. Have a good week in every sense, and let's pray for one another.